Thanks for tuning in to the Mind Matters podcast. Today, we're going to begin our journey into Carl Jung's Red Book with Dr. Kiley Laughlin. This is Kiley Laughlin. He's a doctor, has his PhD in Jungian archetypal psychology. Been a good friend of mine for a long time. Gosh, we've known each other now for about almost a decade.
Almost a decade, yeah.
Yeah. So Kiley was actually my first boss I ever had on active duty in the Army, and was actually my introduction to Jung and his psychology. I think the first time I encountered him, you had sent me the Myers-Briggs and said, "Hey, take this."
Yep.
So, what was your impulse to do that?
Well, I mean, look, I've had an interest in typology for a long time, and at that time I'd already taken the Myers-Briggs type indicator, and I thought it was very interesting. And I thought it was a relatively empirical document or application in the sense that it's been around for a long time. So I thought it'd be interesting as far as you being a young officer, up and coming, to take a look at it, take it, and see if it fit into any of the categories that you knew about yourself in terms of your typology, whether you're a thinker, a feeler, or you're more extroverted, more introverted. And then potentially, especially the fact that you're an ROTC at the time, you could apply any of the insights gleaned from that test into leadership.
You know what was cool about that is I applied that to all the leadership roles I had later. I would pick my leaders and I'd say, "Hey," I never twisted the arm to do it, but I said, you should take this. And I did the same thing that you did. Here's my thought, where you're at.
Exactly.
Take it and tell me where you fit. And sometimes that helped because I'd say, like, okay, this guy, extroverted, real forward, kind of guy. Oh, he's going to be great on a fire team, team leader up there, on the machine gun or something like that. Or this guy's a great thinker. He's going to be excellent in a planning role. And that really helped. It helped me for kind of a vision of my unit and my own leadership.
Yeah.
So coincidentally, I think you had just started at that time the Jungian psychology program that I'm now in.
Go ahead.
What was your impulse for that?
Well, let me do a quick timeline. So I applied. Well, let me give you the background. So as early as 2007, I was actually in Iraq. I took leave. And I wanted to go to a program that specialized in some form of Jungian psychology or analytical psychology. And this actually goes back to 2001, 2002, maybe 2003. As you might know, at Sonoma State, there's also a master's program that's basically a Jungian program.
Yes, I've heard of that.
I can't remember if it's called depth psychology or Jungian psychology or analytical psychology, but Sonoma State has one. So I applied for that, and I didn't have enough credits at the time for, I think it was a few psychology credits I didn't have. So I moved on. I didn't do that. So incidentally, flash forward, and I did all my Army stuff, deployed here, deployed there, Iraq, Kosovo, Bosnia, et cetera. And then in 2009, after I got back from Kosovo, I got a job at ROTC at UC Davis for Forge Gold Battalion, where I eventually met you. And then I was reading Jungian stuff and said, look, I really want to go back to school. I want to go to a grad program where I can do this. And Sonoma State wasn't really going to work out at that particular time because of my job and everything. I needed a program where I could do it remotely, partially, and then be there for a residential program quarterly, and that worked out well. So I applied for Pacifica. It was kind of pricey, as you know, but I applied for it in 2011. So when I met you, I hadn't been in the program yet, but I still knew a lot about Jungian psychology. Now keep in mind, when I was in Iraq, I was reading. I mean, I didn't have much spare time, but
sounds like you were
devouring, just reading books about Jung, right? And I was even reading books about Jung as far back as 2001, 2002, when I was finishing up my bachelor's here in Chico, at Chico State. But to get back to your question, I applied in 2000. I applied to the program in 2011. And then I started in I applied for the program in the winter of 2011. I started the program in autumn 2011. I think you were already gone by then, I think
I was on my way out to infantry officer basic course.
Right.
So you went through the program. You earned your PhD fairly recently.
A couple years ago.
And now I think with this shared commonality between us, I think we see in the world right now a big need and a resurgence for Jung psychology. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that in terms of your personal feelings.
Well, that's always been like the big hope, right, for us like diehard Jungians. A lot of people have tried to do that. I can't remember the guy's name, David Tacey, I think is his name, is a Jungian in Australia. He's talking about that. And Edward Edinger, the late great Jungian theorist and articulator, he basically had these ideas as well, that there'd be a resurgence. And then more recently, of course, you've seen Jordan Peterson pop up, and he's everywhere. He's like ubiquitous.
Real hard to miss. And real controversial.
And controversial. I think in the political stuff, I think a lot of the psychology stuff, he just sticks to psychology. We were talking about this earlier. I don't think he's that controversial. I think a lot of the stuff is rooted in common sense in terms of what he's saying about the psyche. And more importantly, his first book, arguably his best book, most important book, Maps of Meaning, is largely predicated on Jungian psychology. Maps of meaning and the archetypes and these narratives and these stories that he talks about. It's a very deep book, but it comes from Jungian psychology. So, to your point, I think most notably with Jordan Peterson on the rise and being ubiquitous, you can see this resurgence of interest in Carl Jung. In fact, I went to Zurich last year in June, and I had lunch with Thomas Fisher. For those in our audience who don't know, Thomas Fisher is the great grandson of Carl Jung, and he's also works with the Foundation for the Works of C.G. Jung out of Zurich. Great guy. He's about a little bit older than me. But I asked him the question, and this goes back to that June of 2018 last year, and I asked him the question. I said, have you heard of Jordan Peterson, Thomas? He goes, no, I haven't heard of him. And then about 6 months passed, and he emailed me. We were talking about something else, but he emailed me. He goes, yeah, I just want you to know that I did hear about Jordan Peterson, and people are talking about him everywhere over here.
Wow.
In Europe, in Switzerland, because he talks about Jung.
Yes.
And obviously Thomas Fisher is the great grandson of Jung. He has a vested interest in making sure that his grandfather's ideas and theories are rightly taken care of. So that's that. So I think there's resurgence. I think Jordan Peterson has played a substantial role.
I like how you kind of frame that in terms of there's the controversial side, but what he's talking about in terms of the Jungian psychology that he's rooted in, it really is common sense. And I think it fits people's search for meaning now that we're really seeing.
It does. And a lot of people look at his viewership on YouTube. I mean, looking at millions and millions of people. I don't know the exact numbers. Mostly males, to be fair.
And of a certain age group.
But when I went, I was telling you, I took my wife to Jordan Peterson last year at some point. I don't remember exactly when, but I took my wife to see her. And my wife is just, average person in terms of her viewpoints, very moderate. But she went there, and he was talking about, novel concept or very controversial about people accepting responsibility. Have a responsible life. And he's going through his 12 rules for life. That's what the theme of the tour was. But my whole point in saying that is that when I was there, I looked around. There's a huge line, and I saw a broad slice of representation there: men, women, minorities. It was people just hunger for knowledge and a broader insight. I'm very interested in the views or the ideas that he brought to the table.
So now that's what one individual has a great understanding of Jung's concepts able to bring forward. Now, if we go back to Jung, maybe something we were talking about earlier, Jung was creating, I feel, and I think you agree, much more than a simple psychology.
Yeah, Jung was trying to create something much more than a basic psychology. I think we're, like you say, we're on the same page there. Jung was trying to create a dream of a new science, a complete new science.
I'd love for you to talk about this.
Okay. Well, in Sonu Shamdasani, I think he does a fairly thorough job, or a good job.
For those who don't understand, who aren't familiar with Shamdasani,
Sonu Shamdasani is the editor of the Red Book, this book right here. Okay, he's in there. He does a great job of the introduction. That's one. And also, he's a Jung scholar. He's written lots of books. He's one of the editors for the Philemon Foundation, one of the scholars on the Philemon Foundation, and he's written lots and lots of books. In fact, he's finishing up the Black Books right now, and the Black Books are what the contact just came out, but it's okay. He's the editor of the Black Books, and the Black Books essentially is what the Red Book eventually comes from.
So he's editing those now.
Him and other people. I think Martin Liebscher is another guy I met. He's part of the Philemon Foundation. He's doing it among other people, so they're doing that. But that wasn't your question. Your question was about what Jungian psychology really is. I was talking to a friend, and he actually he was a French guy. He actually works at the Jung Institute in Los Angeles. I think he's the executive director. Great guy. but we were talking. He's also a quantum physicist, by the way. So
Wow.
a very smart guy. So we were talking about Jungian psychology, what it really is, and he used the word mosaic. It's a mosaic. And we said, well, what do you mean by mosaic? Well, what is a mosaic, right? Mosaic essentially is a picture. It's a picture of all these different components and parts, right? They all come together.
Composed
They
of
form,
many small
but
pieces.
holistically, they form a greater whole, essentially, and that's what a mosaic is in terms of art. And Jungian psychology was what Jung was aspiring to do with his psychology, which he actually preferred the term complex psychology, by the way, as
Really?
opposed to analytical psychology. And there's a whole other thing I can talk about. But he was trying to create a science, interdisciplinary project where he could bring together various disparate strands of knowledge, epistemological branches, and bring them together holistically to synthesize something completely new, whether it's physics or whether it was even literature, different fields of thought. And what he figured out is that what really connects all these things together in terms of how we conceptualize them is the psyche.
Yes.
Because you can never get outside your psyche. So our models, our paradigms, the way we think, the way we relate to other people is all predicated on the psyche. You can never get outside of your psyche. There's no Archimedean point outside of it. So.
Yeah, outstanding. I think in right now too, as we're seeing, as we're in this contemporary age, this modern age, I think as our sciences and disciplines have maybe gone in much more disparate directions from each other.
Yeah.
We're searching for a way that maybe we can interconnect them holistically, and I see Jung as a vehicle, his work as a vehicle for that.
Yeah, and I think you see a lot of stuff. I mean, Jung, there's no doubt Jung was way ahead of his time. And if you really look at his psychology and you look between the lines in his works and what he was trying to accomplish, what he was doing, is that it predicted, or it almost it had an uncanny way of foresee other sciences in the future, whether it's systems theory or chaos theory, all these new science, quantum physics. With Pauli, the relationship between him and Pauli, and that's a whole other thing we can talk about, I hope, at some point in the future.
I'd love
That's
to.
a very interesting relationship. So there's a certain prescience about Jungian psychology. You could almost see things that were going to come in the future. The drawback is, I was talking to my friend Lance Owens, who's in Utah, and he's a Jungian scholar as well. And he said that he thought, based on his own subjective assessment, is that the interest in Jung kind of peaked in the 80s, and ever since it's been going out. And then there was a resurgence for the Red Book, and then that went up, and we had a lot of interest in it. And then 10 years had passed since the publication of the Red Book, and where are we now? That's what we're trying to answer. So.
Well, I certainly feel that a wave is rising out of the proverbial collective unconscious, and that to be involved in this period of time and have a base of knowledge in you, we could find ourselves at the crest of that wave. Is what I'm kind of hoping.
Yeah, absolutely. So, let me do another parallel here, another side note, but it's applicable to what you're underscoring. And for our audience, I'm not trying to create a parallel between Jung and Christ by no stretch of the imagination, just to emphasize it, but I want to put it in perspective, right? So Christianity comes, right? And I'm not saying Jungian psychology is a religion per se, but nonetheless Christianity comes.
Well, there have been accusations that Jung maybe was positing himself as a savior figure or a Christ figure, right? I mean, it should be important to address that.
People say that.
I don't agree with that, but there have been maybe a short-sighted view, I would say.
I've never seen anywhere in any of the literature for Jung's works where he said, "I am a savior," or "I am a prophet." In fact, on the other hand, in his some of his interviews, he said, "I'm not a prophet. I'm not trying to form a religion." It's actually quoted from him, so to speak. Now. So that's that. Now, people.
Thank you. I just want to put that out there.
That is it's on the record in his works. Now, other people can argue things, and maybe somebody knows something I don't, or read something I haven't. But that's what I've seen, and I think it's C.G. Jung speaking where he talks about that.
Interesting.
But where was I going? I lost my train of thought. Christ. Christianity, right? It's not like Christ came, lived, crucified, and died, and went to heaven, and all of a sudden there was Christianity. It didn't just happen that way. There's a movement, and it took a lot of time for Christianity to actually establish itself,
coalesce into what
become what it was, and it wasn't just Christ. It was a lot of people that were pushing that movement, or that were carrying the message of that movement, whether it's Paul or the other apostles, or people in Rome that actually adopted it. So there's a lot of different factors at play with the early formation of the Christian church, and it just happened overnight. And you look at Jungian psychology, and again, I'm not trying to draw a straight comparison between Jungian psychology and Christianity, but Jung died in 1961. It hasn't even been 60 years since he passed away, right? That's nothing
Right.
when you're looking at the lengthy period of centuries and millennia. So I think it's going to take time to figure out how this all pans out. I don't think we're there yet. It will take.
I think you're right. I think the fact that we're drawn to it, we're still at. That's the exciting part to me. There is a lot of potential there. You mentioned the Red Book coming out. And we came out fairly recently, and we have a copy of it right here. As you can notice, it's a large book, and it's has a really interesting history. We've thought about maybe doing a series on the Red Book itself, exploring it, and we may do that in the future. But maybe since we brought it up and it's here, maybe you could talk a little bit about what it actually is.
Okay, well, let's talk about what the Red Book is.
Great.
Okay, now our audience can see it. It's a Red Book. Of course, it's not the real Red Book. This is a copy. One of the many copies that came out was published in 2009, and it took Shamdasani many years to go through this process. It took politicking, it took permissions, it took a lot of coordination through the editor and the publisher, et cetera. But let's talk about what the Red Book is and what it isn't. Okay, the Red Book is not really the Red Book. Okay, that's not the name of it. It's red, as you can see, but that's why people call it the Red Book, right? And the original Red Book is red. It's like red leather, vellum. The Red Book is actually called Liber Novus, which is Latin, obviously, for new book. There's a reason Jung did that, So take the Red Book out, it's just called Liber Novus, okay? The new book. It's called the new book because it's what Jung wanted it to be called, and that's what he titled it. And where did the new book, or Liber Novus, come from? Well, it came from a series, I believe, of 7 journal diaries from Carl Jung. Spanned a lengthy period of time. In fact, I think the first one started in around 1901 or 1902. In fact, the first volume wasn't even black; it was brown, and it started off when he was at Bergolzi in Zurich, and he started carrying these on after he started writing them down and recording his fantasies. So the Red Book, Liber Novus, is actually a documentation of Jung's confrontation with his unconscious. And I use the term unconscious very loosely. It's him having an experiment on himself, going into himself, seeing what's there, and in some cases dialoguing with what he finds there, and noting it, taking notes of what he sees, of what he experiences, what he encounters, and putting it and documenting it in a series of black books, of journals, essentially. He does that for a series of months, a series of years. I believe between 1913, 1916 was when most of the fantasies took place, most of the content in the so-called black books. And he eventually would take that and he would work through it and he would edit it, because obviously, if you're in your journal and you're writing stuff down, that's not gonna be the final edit, right? You're gonna kind of work through it and make it sound better. And that's what Jung did with his edited drafts of Liber Novus. And eventually, when he got to where he wanted to be, he commissioned a bookseller, I think in Zurich somewhere, to give him a red leather bound big book called a Red Book, essentially, and he put Liber Novus on there, and he started to transcribe from his corrected drafts and from his black books.
So it really has been refined and edited by himself.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful work.
Yeah.
It's calligraphy.
Yeah.
And
real
detailed art.
In the calligraphy, you can see it in there. So initially, there's 3 parts. Again, Liber Novus is divided by 3 parts. Liber Primus, Liber Secundus, and Liber Tertius, or Scrutinies. And they have names, right? I think that the first one is the Way of What Is to Come, Images of the Aryan is part 2, and then the third and final part, volume 3, is Scrutinies. And every single one has a certain meaning to it, right? They have a climax, and they have a plot, and things taking place, different things. So it's 3 books. So Liber Novus is actually 3 books. And it's kind of like the Bible. And I say the Bible, I'm not saying it's like just like the Bible, but Bible is a library. It's a series of books, a collection of books. And Liber Novus, the new book, is a collection of actually 3 books: Liber Primus, Liber Secundus, and Liber Tertius, or it's called Scrutinies as well. They all have 3 names.
I wonder. You mentioned something about when the fantasies took place, and previously we were talking about the reality of the psyche, and the reality of the figures that he encountered at some point within his psyche. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the distinction and the importance in here about the fantasy versus reality that's contained within the psyche, as it pertains to the Liber Novus itself.
This is how you got to look at it. I think you really have to. I don't think we have time to go into Jung's epistemology or his ontological system in terms of psychic realism or esse anonyma, but you have to understand what Jung is saying here. He says a dream or a fantasy, in many ways, is just as real as this book or this shelf or this plant or this wall. It's just as real. It's real differently.
Well, that's a potentially, any way you look at it, that's a revolutionary concept
for
people, particularly in the modern age, to sort of inculcate into their viewpoints.
Well, think about this for a second. If you look at it, most people would say, well, no, a dream is not real. If I have an active imagination and I have this thought image or something I see, it's not real, it's just my mind. It is real, though, because you experience it. Now, the difference is you can't get my mind to see that, but it's still influencing my behavior. In fact, think about this for a minute. In terms of mentally ill people or people that do crazy things or terrible things, like all these shootings that you see.
Right.
And a lot of those, not all cases, but in many cases, things are predicated off something that's psychic in their head, right? It could be a fantasy, it could be some type of imbalance, it could be an illness, it could be voices telling them to do something. Now, those unreal voices, those unreal fantasies, those unreal images have very real consequences.
Yes.
So, in a lot of ways, it's just as real as this book, as this plant, as this wall, because fantasies and images and things that take place in your imagination or your mind can have real world consequences. So, so that's that. So that's what you're saying. Is that, in a sense, an image in your mind, a fantasy, a dream, is just as real as these physical objects we see out in the world and we interact with, our body interacts with. So that's one thing. So when up to this point, of course, 1912, 1913, Jung breaks with Freud. He feels destabilized. He knows his life's different now. It's going to be different for the rest of his life. So he's asking himself, okay, what now? What next? And thankfully, Jung was financially independent because he was married to the daughter of one of the richest men in Switzerland at the time. So that was good for him. So he started to do what other people don't have the opportunity to do. He started to do some really deep reflection about who he is and what is really going on in this world. And he basically started to do a series of visualization techniques, let's say around the summer of 1913. And that eventually culminates, I think it culminated in November, I don't know the exact date, of 1913, where he talks about this in Memories and Reflections. He let himself drop, right? So every night he was going deeper and deeper, but at one point he just let himself drop. It was like being in space and landing on the moon and on this crater.
He had, in effect, cultivated that deep set and setting he needed.
Yeah, set and setting, and that's what it was. And that's very interesting because long before, any of this talk about Timothy Leary or Ram Dass, or even Albert Hoffman. Of course, Albert Hoffman was actually a contemporary of Jung, a little bit younger, but he was around there. In fact, he was from Basel, where Jung was born. But long before these people, Jung was talking about set and setting, or at least he understood the concept. He applied it to himself through his visualization techniques. And what's interesting about that, he was even experimenting with yoga,
Yes.
So he understood all this stuff. And, in 1911, 1912, he was publishing Symbols of Transformation. So he had this broad knowledge of Eastern philosophy, of Greek mythology, of Mithraism, of all these different fields of
real wide spectrum of
study
practices.
Absolutely, and he saw that. He saw that. So he tried these visualization techniques. Now, one thing I'm going to write a paper on it, and I haven't had a chance yet to do it. That I'd like to try to explore further. In fact, I have a pending question out to Sono Shamdasani because he mentions a guy in this book, Ludwig Stoudemire. We were talking about him earlier. Yes. Jung had a copy of his book. We all know that. The book is called Magic as an Experimental Science. It's never been translated in English. We had a copy of this book, and if you go in the book, it's just peppered with marginalia notes. And let me rephrase that, just like underlinings here, about 80 or 90 pages throughout the entire book. The book's about maybe 200, 240 pages or so. So Jung obviously was interested in that book. And we look at what the premise of the book is. It seems to me it's a reasonable inference that he got some of his ideas from Stoudemire as he moved into his confrontation with the unconscious.
Well, that is interesting to explore.
Now, the drawback about that, and I looked everywhere so far, you can't find any reference. I think actually he mentions it in one place in the Zarathustra seminar. He mentions Stoudemire briefly. But beyond that, I can't find any other direct citation or quote about Stoudemire from Jung directly in the collected works or in his seminars or letters. So we're not quite there yet, but pending more research, right, and study. So yeah, Jung, in terms of his fantasies, fantasy was just as real. That first time he encountered two products of his, I don't want to say products of his imagination, because that suggests that it's not real, but it was in his imagination.
Maybe he was in the right spot to make a connection.
Connection with something inside him, but not inside him.
Well, maybe something that we all have access to.
Yeah, and that's a possibility.
Which is what I think maybe this is demonstrating to us, that we can...
Yeah.
He's showing us maybe a pathway.
I think he's showing us a pathway into something within ourselves that we all have access to potentially. But he encounters Elijah and Salome on this like lunarscape, right? There's a temple or something in the background. He also sees a snake in a tree. So the symbolism's there. He saw this rife in symbolism. Elijah. Well, why is the guy's name Elijah? Why is her name Salome? Well, there's symbolic import or significance to those names. You know, Jung already knew this. And the snake is obviously symbolic too of a lot of different things in mythology and religion. So you believe they were just as real as the clouds in the sky and the trees of the earth.
And if I could ask you, clearly you're well versed in this, and I'm sure you probably undergo your own sort of praxis, your own inner work.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you concur with Jung that that's accessible and that is something?
I do. Now the drawback is I try to be skeptical. You know, I got to be skeptical about everything. I've never had.
Well, that's science, right?
That's what science. You want to question things, be skeptical, look at things, be open minded. Also have a healthy skeptical attitude. I think it's a good thing. I've never experienced anything like Jung, like he's talking about in the Red Book. I've never had fantasies that deep, that profound, that elaborate. I have not, and I've never had a fantasy talk back to me. And I'm writing it down. But Jung said they're real. These beings, these thought forms, for lack of a better term, they were real. But I've never experienced that, so I can't say. I've had my other experiences that are kind of strange, you know, but nothing like that. So I don't know.
But maybe we all get further down that path, and maybe we have a similar experience. Maybe he shows us.
I think, and a lot of people have had similar experiences. A lot of people in history, a lot of people in mythology, a lot of people, a lot of artists, a lot of writers. You know, Nietzsche. You know, folks have had similar experiences, not maybe quite as elaborate. And even mythology people, you know, figures in mythology, whether it's Theseus or otherwise, they have these experiences, excuse me. And Nietzsche, he doesn't talk about it readily, but Nietzsche went in the unconscious.
Yes.
The difference is that he never came back out.
Come back out.
Yeah.
Right. I think that you touched on the magical portion of it. Which holds a great interest to me because I've done a lot of reading myself as a personal interest into different types of sort of magic practices. Anything from Franz Bourdon to meditative practices like Ram Dass, things like that. And you see thought forms come up, things like that.
Yeah.
And we use these different terms that I think have are cross cultural.
Yeah.
And through Jung, we're seeing a sign. I don't know if the right term would be a scientific study of those things, incorporation to that to be utilized.
There's another angle to this. I mean, I think what you're saying, if I hear you correctly, there's different names for these phenomena in different cultures, different strains of thought, ranging from the east to the west. And I always thought it was uncanny and very interesting that there's a concept in Eastern philosophy, particularly in Tantric Buddhism, called a tulpa.
Oh, yes.
We've talked about tulpas before, right? And what's interesting about that is that Alexandria David Neal was a explorer and a scholar, from France, a female obviously, and she lived in Tibet, and she writes about it in a book called The Magic Mystery of Tibet, which Jung had a copy of, by the way. So he was very familiar with his work. In fact, he talks about her in his ETH lectures. And she documents, she documents her travels in Tibet. She says, I encountered tulpas, these little thought forms would follow me around, and you had to use the power of your imagination or mind to dissolve them, because you give them life.
You feed them.
You feed them energy, right?
Your
Energy.
psychic energy is feeding them.
That's the argument or the theory behind it. Now, I've never encountered a tulpa, but it's very interesting to find these parallels between what Jung's talking about in Liber Novus and what Alexandria David Nill has observed, or at least claimed to observe in her own travels in Tibet. It's not just her; other people have seen these things too.
We've been doing a sort of dream work in one of the courses I'm taking,
Sure.
which is interesting because what you're talking about makes me think about encountering these in the process of utilizing active imagination. I mean, that's what you went really deep into that, and we say that imagination is the vehicle for it. But I think maybe those entities, those images, those beings, maybe they're waiting for us, not as a product of our imagination, but the imagination as a vehicle to access them.
Yeah.
And I strongly felt that as I was doing some of these things and recording my dreams and the dream work, I almost had sort of a glimpse that, oh my gosh, this is what many of the greats throughout history have done. People like Jung, people like Nietzsche, they've reached their daemon or their higher.
Well, even Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the great English poet, he has a famous poem called Kubla Khan. And what's interesting about the poem is the fact that he claims this. He says, look, I was opium addict. He was opium addict. He ingested large amounts of opium. And he'd go into these opium-induced stupors, trance-like states, and he had no recollection, ostensibly, of what he was writing, but he would come out of the trance and have this poem written before him. So the question is, did he write the poem, or did the unconscious write the poem? And the poem is very exotic and very interesting. I mean, it's like something otherworldly, like stuff in Liber Novus, So that's just to give us an example of people ostensibly creating stuff, or creating works of art or other products that they don't have conscious recollection or conscious intention of doing so. Right?
Yeah, and I think that right now in our time we identify highly, obviously, with this sort of left-brained rationalism that's allowed us to have the nice things like the ability to communicate on this podcast, and also create much of what we experience in the modern world at the expense of a connection we may have previously had. That we deem as spiritual, imaginative, things like that. And so maybe through a further examination of the Red Book, if you'd be willing to do that as you spoke about, we could maybe dive into that and sort of explore it through that context and what that could mean now for us.
No, I think that's important. That's really important to do that eventually, and take a look at that in a subsequent podcast or video. We can talk about it and go more into detail, because we can really talk about this stuff for a lengthy period of time. But I think it's apropos to share something with you. I'm going to grab Liber Novus here and just open this up and kind of set the stage and why this is important. So, there you go. There's Liber Novus. And of course, Dr. Shamdasani did a great job not transcribing it, but taking it, breaking it all down, putting his footnotes on here. But as you can see, for those who don't know what Liber Novus is, there's what it looks like. It's all in German calligraphy. Jung did that himself over many laborious hours. And if you go over here and flash forward, and as you can see, that's the introduction right there that Sono did. And then you go even further and you see this is all the transcription essentially from the German calligraphy in the front of the book itself. But to that point, let me just jump into the beginning here. I just want to do this because I think I'm going to press out here.
Please, yeah, it works.
Okay. Big book. Okay, so right here, the first, this is the introduction. Descend into hell, Refining the Soul. Okay, Refining the Soul, the way of what is to come, is the first book, Liber Primus, called The Way of What is to Come, and that's
here we are.
Even very important. So Jung opens it up with a few verses from Isaiah, and Isaiah is important because it's actually a work of prophecy in the Old Testament. He talks about John as well. But you go over here to the very beginning. I gotta find it. So we got biblical verses. And he opens up. He says, written by C.G. Jung with his own hand in his house in Kussnacht, Zurich, in the year 1915. Of course, this is the transcription piece here. And he says here, it says, if I speak in the spirit of this time, I must say, no one and nothing can justify what I must proclaim to you. Justification is superfluous to me, as I have no choice. but I must. I have learned that in addition to the spirit of this time, there is still another spirit at work, namely that rules the depths of everything contemporary. The spirit of this time would like to hear of use and value. I also thought this way, and my humanity still thinks this way, but that other spirit forces me nevertheless to speak beyond justification, use, and meaning. And we'll stop there for now because that I think warrants some unpacking in terms of what
Definitely.
he was talking about.
And I think that'll frame nicely our next, hopefully our next podcast to continue this.
No, absolutely, we can do that. But Jung's talking at the very beginning. He talks about two different things, right? The spirit of the times.
Mhm.
That's what we're in
Sort
right
of
now.
the zeitgeist.
The zeitgeist, that paradigm of wherever it is. In that particular case, it was European culture, 1913, 1914.
Any I'm sure historian will know what was going on at that
Yeah,
period of
and
time.
that's
Huge
very
conflagration in Europe.
very
World War
apropos
One.
as well. And Jung's going through all this stuff at the time, and at that time, when he was writing these in his black books, by the way, and his fantasies, World War I had not broken out yet. It was like, I think, November of 1913, World War I broke out
One could argue he anticipated that with very, very prophetic visions.
Well, there's the anecdotal story about him being on the train to Schlafhausen and the vision of Europe filling up with blood
Over the mountains into
Right.
Switzerland.
Right, and then he thought he was originally doing a schizophrenia, and but he thought he was objective about it, wrote everything down, and then of course when the war broke out, I think it was August 1st, 1914, around there, he realized that, at least he believed, that he captured something in the future. He tapped into the spirit of the depths, the unconscious, which is beyond space and time, so he's able to capture a snippet of the future, essentially. And that's what he's opening up about. And Jung felt very confident that he had to write Liber Novus. You heard what I said. He felt compelled to write all this stuff down, whether you believed it or not, whether there's any justification to it, whatever its practical utility was. He felt compelled he had to get this out. He had to get it out of the system. He had to transcribe all the notes, and he had to create something. And maybe, I mean, who knows? I wasn't there, but maybe he knew at some point in the future it would be published at the right time. And it was long after he died, almost 50 years after he died, it was published. And now, 10 years after it was published, here we are still talking about it. So.
Yeah, well, it seems like it's ripe for a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe we can pick this up the next time. We can start diving a little more into it.
Sounds
and
good.
Also, I'd really love to hear more about the paper you mentioned.
Yes.
Because that's really right up my alley.
I'm working on that. I'm working on that paper, and hopefully I'll get more angles, more clues. But when that happens, maybe I can come back and we can talk more about what I've learned so far.
Maybe before we finish, if you want to direct anyone who wants to know a little bit more about you, the work you're doing, anywhere where you could find maybe a website.
Yeah, so I do have a personal website. It's kqlaughlin.com, kqlaughlin.com, and all my information is right there. I have my papers. I have references to who I am, what my interests are, if you're interested. I'm also on academia.edu, and I have all my papers up there as well. And a PhD in depth psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute. I'm also in the military, and I'm going to write a book when I have time. So that's who I am.
Okay. Well, thanks for being with us.
Hey, thank you.
Can't wait to pick it up again.
Likewise.
Thanks a lot,
Dennis. Appreciate it. Take care.
All right.